Imagine that you are missing, not just lost, but gone, erased from the world without a trace. And then, 8 years later, you are found, not in a forest, not at the bottom of a lake, but deep inside an abandoned mine that has been welded shut from the inside. You are sitting, leaning against the cold stone wall, next to the person you love. It looks as if you have simply fallen asleep, but you are not sleeping, and the bones in your legs are broken. This is not a story from a horror movie. This is the real, heartbreaking story of Sarah and Andrew. It is a story about how a simple 3-day trip to the desert turned into an 8-year mystery, and how the final answer to that mystery turned out to be more terrifying and monstrous than anyone could have ever imagined. To understand the world that Sarah and Andrew drove into, we must first travel back to the mid-20th century, to the height of the Cold War. As the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a tense nuclear arms race, a new kind of gold rush swept across the vast, empty deserts of the American Southwest. This was not a rush for gold or silver, but for a far more powerful and dangerous element: uranium. The Atomic Energy Commission, desperate for the raw material to build its nuclear arsenal, offered massive financial incentives to anyone who could find it. This ignited the great uranium boom of the 1950s, a wave of modern-day prospectors, armed with little more than a pickup truck, a Geiger counter, and a dream of striking it rich, fanned out across the desolate landscapes of Utah, Colorado, and Arizona. They blasted and drilled thousands of mines into the red rock plateaus and canyons, creating a labyrinth of tunnels and shafts. These were often small, hastily dug operations, poorly documented, and even more poorly secured. When the boom ended in the 1960s, the prospectors simply walked away, leaving behind a scarred and haunted landscape. They left thousands of abandoned mines littering the desert, their entrances often hidden by overgrown brush or collapsed timbers. They are invisible traps, forgotten vertical shafts, and dark, unstable tunnels that honeycomb the earth, silent and waiting. It was this eerie, post-industrial wilderness, a land of immense beauty, but also of hidden, man-made dangers, that Sarah and Andrew chose for their weekend getaway. Our story begins in 2011. Sarah, 26, and Andrew, 28, were an ordinary, happy couple from Colorado. They weren't extreme adventurers or experienced survivalists. They were just two people who shared a love for quiet places and the stark beauty of the desert. Their plan was as simple and innocent as could be. Take their old but reliable car, drive to the remote desert lands of eastern Utah, pitch a tent for 3 days and 2 nights, take pictures of the unique scenery, and just be together, away from the noise of the city. They were specifically drawn to the area of the old uranium mines, not to explore them, but to photograph the strange, almost alien landscape of rusting equipment and abandoned structures set against the backdrop of the red desert. They weren't looking for trouble. They were looking for beauty in decay. Before leaving on Friday morning, Sarah sent a simple, cheerful message to her sister. "We're leaving. We'll be back on Sunday evening. Love you." That was the last message anyone in their families would ever receive from them. They packed the standard tourist kit, a tent, sleeping bags, a cooler with food, and several gallons of water. They didn't take any climbing gear or specialized equipment for exploring mines because they had no intention of doing so. Their interest was in the surface, the views of the desert at sunset. The weekend passed. Sunday evening came and went. Sarah and Andrew did not return. At first, no one panicked. Cell reception in the desert is notoriously bad. Perhaps their old car had broken down, or they had simply decided to stay an extra day and couldn't call. But when both of them failed to show up for their jobs on Monday morning without a word, a cold dread began to set in. Their families immediately sounded the alarm. A massive search and rescue operation was launched that same day. The desert in this part of Utah is a vast, almost endless space of canyons, rocky plateaus, and dry riverbeds. Finding two people here is a monumental task. Search teams in four-wheel drive vehicles and ATVs began to comb the network of known and abandoned roads. A helicopter was sent up, its crew scanning the immense landscape for hours, looking for any sign of human presence, a glint of metal from a car, the color of a tent, the smoke from a campfire. But the days passed, and they found nothing. It was as if the couple and their car had simply vanished into thin air as soon as they left their city. With each passing day, hope began to fade. The desert is a place that does not forgive mistakes. The daytime heat is punishing, and the nights are cold. Without a reliable source of water, a person's chances of survival diminish with every hour. The police began to consider other grim possibilities. A criminal theory seemed unlikely. The area was so remote and sparsely populated that the chances of a random, violent attack were extremely low. The theory that they had run away to start a new life was also quickly dismissed. Their bank accounts were untouched, their credit cards unused. They had left their beloved pets with a neighbor. People who plan to disappear forever do not do these things. Then, on the 7th day of the search, when hope was almost entirely gone, the helicopter pilot spotted it, a faint, rhythmic glint of light, flashing in the harsh afternoon sun. It was the hazard lights of a car. The helicopter guided a ground team to the location. There, parked on a forgotten, barely visible dirt track, was Sarah and Andrew's car. The road led towards the old uranium mines and ended a few miles further on. The car was in the middle of the track, as if it had simply been abandoned. The hazard lights were still blinking faintly, the battery almost completely drained. The discovery was a breakthrough, but it was also deeply perplexing. The police began to inspect the vehicle. There were no signs of a break-in, no damage from an accident, and no signs of foul play. The doors were unlocked. Inside, it looked as if the owners had just stepped away for a moment. A map of the area lay on the passenger seat next to an empty water bottle. Andrew's phone was found in the glove compartment. Forensic experts later confirmed that there were no missed calls and no attempts to call for help. The battery was still more than half charged. This suggested they were in an area with no cell service and knew it. But why was the car abandoned? An officer checked the gas tank. It was completely empty. That explained the stop. They had simply run out of fuel. Turning on the hazard lights so the car would be visible was a logical act, but the most important and most chilling clue was on the screen of their portable GPS navigator. It was still on, and it showed a plotted route leading from the car further down the deserted road to the location of one specific named mine. The search team, now with a renewed sense of hope and a specific destination, immediately set off on foot. Following the route indicated by the navigator, they walked for a couple of miles along the sun-scorched, barely visible path. Finally, they reached their destination, the entrance to an old, abandoned uranium mine. It was an unremarkable hole in the rock, littered with rusty scrap metal and old, rotting boards. They cautiously examined the entrance and the surrounding area, but they found nothing. No footprints, no belongings, no signs that people had been there recently. The desert wind had erased any tracks. The rescuers shouted Sarah's and Andrew's names into the dark mouth of the mine, but only a deep, cold silence answered back. The trail had gone completely cold. All their essential gear, the tent, the sleeping bags, their food and water was missing, just like Sarah and Andrew themselves. The official search was eventually called off, leaving the families with an unbearable, unanswered mystery. The only clues were a car with an empty tank and a GPS pointing to a dark hole in the earth. And for 8 long years, the desert kept its silence. 8 years passed. For the families of Sarah and Andrew, it was a period of agonizing, unending limbo. For the police, their case was now a cold one, filed away in a cabinet, a collection of perplexing clues that led nowhere. For most of the world, the story had become just another one of those dark legends told around campfires. A sad reminder of how easily the vast and indifferent wilderness can swallow people whole. The case gathered dust in the archives, and it would have remained there forever had it not been for 2 local men who, in the autumn of 2019, decided to earn some extra money by collecting scrap metal. These men were not detectives or adventurers. They simply knew that the area of the old uranium mines was a graveyard of abandoned equipment, rusting machinery that could be cut up and sold. On one hot afternoon, they drove their old pickup truck along the same forgotten roads where Sarah and Andrew's car had been found 8 years prior. Their destination was the very same mine that the couple's GPS had pointed to, not because they knew this detail, but simply because it was a large site where they hoped to find a good haul of metal. But when they arrived at the entrance, they saw that something had changed. The opening in the rock, which the original search party had described as being simply littered with junk, now looked sealed. Someone had dragged a large, heavy, and rusted sheet of thick industrial metal over the entrance and had secured it by piling stones and old wooden beams against it. It was strange. This was not an official closure by a mining company. It looked as if someone had hastily, but very securely, tried to hide something or to prevent anyone from ever getting inside. For the scrap hunters, this large metal sheet was itself a valuable prize. They fired up their gas-powered cutting torch and began the long, loud process of cutting a hole in the sheet large enough to crawl through. When they finally finished, the opening emitted a gust of musty, cold, and completely still air, the kind of dead air that only exists in a place that has been hermetically sealed for many years. One of the men shone a powerful flashlight inside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing bare stone walls and a floor strewn with small rocks. He moved the beam further into the darkness, and then it stopped. At the far end of this small first chamber, about 15 meters from the entrance, were two figures. They were just sitting on the floor, their backs leaning against the far wall, their heads slightly bowed. From a distance, in the flickering flashlight beam, they looked like discarded mannequins. The man called out to his partner, who also peered inside and froze. They both stared silently into the darkness. "Those are people," one of them said quietly. The police officers who had worked on the original case in 2011 were now older, some retired, but they remembered every detail. When the call came in about 2 bodies found in that specific mine, they knew. An investigation team and forensic experts were dispatched to the site. The scene inside was exactly as the scrap hunters had described. 2 bodies, a man and a woman, sitting calmly next to each other. Their hiking clothes were decayed from age, but not torn. There were no backpacks, no water bottles, nothing around them. The dry, still air of the sealed mine had perfectly mummified their bodies, preserving them in that calm, final posture. DNA analysis soon confirmed what everyone already knew. It was Sarah and Andrew. The 8-year search was over, but as one mystery was solved, a new, even more terrifying one began. What had happened to them inside that mine? A detailed autopsy revealed the first shocking and inexplicable clue. Both Sarah and Andrew had multiple severe fractures in their lower legs, broken shins, ankles, and feet. These were not injuries from a simple trip and fall. A medical examiner concluded that these injuries were consistent with a fall from a significant height, at least 10 meters, over 30 feet. But how was that possible? They were found in a horizontal mine shaft. And how could they be sitting so calmly if they had suffered such violent injuries? The investigators re-examined the mine, and this time they looked up. Directly above the spot where the bodies were found, there was another hole in the ceiling, narrow, vertical mine shaft that went straight up towards the surface. A new, terrifying theory began to form. Sarah and Andrew had never entered the mine through the side entrance. They had fallen into it from above, tumbling down a hidden, unmarked vertical shaft, crashing onto the stone floor below, shattering their legs. They were alive, but they were horrifically injured and completely immobilized. They were trapped. This theory explained the broken legs, but it made another detail of the scene even more impossible. Who had sealed the side exit and why? The investigators performed a forensic analysis on the heavy metal sheet. They discovered that it had been professionally welded to the surrounding rock frame, and the analysis of the weld beads proved conclusively and impossibly that the welding had been done from the inside. But there was no welding equipment inside the mine. No generator, no torch, no tools, not even a hammer. It was an impossible crime scene. Someone had entered the mine, welded the only exit shut from the inside, and then vanished, without a trace, taking all their equipment with them. The police now realized they were hunting for a monster. Someone had found Sarah and Andrew wounded, helpless, and trapped at the bottom of a shaft, and instead of calling for help, that person had made a conscious decision to bury them alive. He, or they, had dragged the heavy metal sheet to the side entrance, expertly welded it shut, and condemned the couple to a slow, agonizing death in the pitch-black darkness from thirst and starvation. The police now had a profile of their suspect. It had to be someone who knew these abandoned mines intimately, someone with a deep knowledge of their secret passages and shafts. It had to be someone with access to heavy-duty welding equipment, and it had to be someone who lived nearby. The investigators began to do what they should have done 8 years ago. They started digging up all the old property and lease records for the vast, abandoned lands around the mines. They found that the specific plot of land where the mine was located was on a long-term lease to a private individual. He was a man in his 60s who lived alone on a small, isolated ranch a few dozen miles away. Neighbors described him as a hostile recluse who hated trespassers. For the police, this was the first real lead they had in the entire case. They obtained a search warrant for his home. When they arrived, the man greeted them with a cold, hostile stare. He denied everything. But during a search of his workshop, investigators found the final, damning pieces of the puzzle. They found a set of keys to the old gates that blocked some of the mine entrances. And in a drawer, they found a hand-drawn, detailed map of the mine's internal passages. The map not only marked the main entrance and the vertical shaft, but also a series of narrow, unknown ventilation tunnels. One of these tunnels led from the very chamber where Sarah and Andrew were found and exited on the surface almost a mile away. This was the answer. This was how the killer had disappeared after sealing the entrance from the inside. He had his own secret way out. When confronted with the map, the man's silence broke. He told his story, not with remorse, but with a chilling, emotionless detachment. He said he had been patrolling his property that day and heard their screams for help. He found them in the mine, injured. But in his twisted, paranoid mind, they were not victims. They were intruders, a problem on his land. He did not speak to them. He simply walked away. He returned to his ranch, loaded his welding equipment into his truck, drove to the side entrance of the mine, and sealed it shut. In his logic, he wasn't murdering them. He was securing his property. He insisted to the very end that they were to blame for trespassing. The fact that he had left 2 wounded people to die in unimaginable horror behind that metal door did not seem to bother him at all. The trial was swift. He was found guilty and sentenced to prison. The mystery was solved. Behind the inexplicable disappearance were neither monsters nor ghosts. There was only a man whose paranoid hatred of strangers proved to be far more monstrous than any desert legend.